The flowers on her windowsill had died 3 days ago, and Mabel had not thrown them away. She told herself it was because she had been busy. There were linens to fold, candles to trim, a cracked shutter on the east window that rattled every time the wind came down from the northern ridge. There were always things to do in a small house that belonged to no one important. But the truth was simpler and harder to say. The flowers had been a gift from her mother, dried lavender and white clover bundled with a strip of linen, left on the sill the morning Mabel had been given away. She had kept them alive with careful water and soft hands for 11 months. Now they were dust and brittle stems, and something in her could not yet let go. She pressed her fingertips against a dead petal. It crumbled. Outside, Ashevale was beginning its slow morning. She could hear it, the creak of the mill wheel turning in the stream below the eastern slope, the low call of a cart driver guiding his horse through the main road's mud, the distant bark of a dog that belonged to the tanner's wife. The village smelled of wet earth and chimney smoke at this hour, and somewhere beneath it, faint as a rumor, came the scent of pine resin from the forest that bordered everything in Ashevale like a dark hem. Mabel pulled her gray wool cloak from the hook by the door. She was 23 years old, and she lived alone in a house that was technically not hers. It belonged to the Fen pack, or rather, to the man she had been promised to at 17, married to at 21, and abandoned by at 22. The house had been part of the arrangement her father had negotiated before his death, a union between the last daughter of the Caldwell lineage and Dorian Fen, second son of Alpha Edric Fen of the Ashevale pack. A respectable match, everyone had said. A safe one. She had believed them. Mabel crossed the narrow lane toward the market, her boots sinking slightly into the morning mud. Her braid, the color of winter wheat, was still damp from the basin wash she'd done before dawn. She kept her eyes forward. She had learned, in the past year, that looking at people too long invited their pity, and she did not want it. Pity was just another way of saying we all knew. The market square was not yet crowded. A few women from the upper holdings were examining bolts of rough linen near the draper's stall. 2 boys hauled a crate of salt blocks past the alehouse door. Old Sarah, who sold dried herbs and bone broth, was arranging her jars with the methodical care of someone who had been doing the same thing for 40 years. Mabel. Sarah's voice was quiet, not unkind. Mabel stopped. Good morning. You look pale. I always look pale. The old woman's eyes moved over her face in a way that said more than her words. They're saying Dorian is coming back. The mud seemed to pull harder at her boots. Who is saying that? Mabel asked. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. Half the pack by now. Sarah wrapped a bundle of dried rosemary in cloth without looking up. Edric Fen sent a letter to the council. His son is returning from the Eastern Territories, within the fortnight. Mabel said nothing. She stood very still while the morning moved around her. A woman laughing near the grain stall. A horse snorting. The mill wheel turning, turning, turning. He was the one who left, she said finally, not as a question. He was. Sarah handed her the rosemary without charging her for it. But the pack law is the pack law, Mabel. If he returns and does not formally dissolve the union before the council, you are still bound. She walked home without buying anything. The letter arrived before noon. It was delivered by a Fen pack runner, a boy she recognized by his green armband. And it bore the wax seal of Alpha Edric, a wolf's head pressed deep into dark red. Mabel held it for a long time before she opened it, sitting at the small table in the kitchen with a cup of cold tea she hadn't drunk. The letter was short, formal. It informed her, in Edric Fen's careful and slightly pompous hand, that his son Dorian would be returning to Ashevale within 10 days, that his time in the Eastern Territories had brought clarity and growth, and that he intended to resume his responsibilities as a bonded member of the Ashevale pack, including his domestic responsibilities. That was the phrase. Domestic responsibilities. She was a domestic responsibility. Mabel set the letter down on the table. She pressed both palms flat against the wood and breathed in slowly. The kitchen smelled of yesterday's bread and the last of the pine resin she used to seal the window cracks. Outside, the wind had picked up, and she could hear the dead lavender on the sill rattling faintly in its dried stems. She thought about Dorian Fenn with the careful distance of someone who had spent a year learning not to feel the wrong things. Dark hair, easy smile, the kind of man who always seemed to be standing in the best light in a room. He had been charming at first, not deeply, but enough. Enough that a girl who had just lost her father and been handed to strangers could find something to hold on to. He had been present for the first months, present enough. Then the Eastern correspondence had begun. Business, he'd said. Pack affairs. She had believed him because she had wanted to, and because no one told her otherwise. She had found out the truth from a letter that was not meant for her. It had fallen from his coat, slipped out when he'd hung it on the hook before dinner, and she had picked it up without thinking. The handwriting was not his. It was a woman's hand, looping and warm, signed with a name she didn't recognize, from a village in the Eastern Ridge she'd never heard of. The content had been brief. It did not need to be long to be devastating. I am waiting for you. Come back, and don't bring her with you this time. She had never told him she had read it. She had folded it exactly as she found it and placed it back in his coat pocket, and set his dinner on the table and said nothing. 2 weeks later, he was gone. No argument, no confrontation. Just a note on the table that said he needed time. He had been gone 11 months, and now he was coming back. She could not stay in that house. The thought arrived without drama, without tears. Just a clean, quiet certainty that settled in her chest like a stone dropping through still water. She could not be here when he walked through that door. She could not stand in the kitchen that was not her kitchen, in the house that was not her house, and watch Dorian Fenn arrange himself back into her life as though he had only stepped out for an afternoon. She had no family left in Ashevale. Her father was 3 years dead. Her mother had moved north to live with relatives after the marriage, sending lavender and clover and letters that grew shorter as the months went on. She had no rank within the pack. She was human, or near enough, with only a trace of wolf blood from a grandmother she'd never met, not enough to matter in any official sense. She had no money beyond what she had saved from mending and small trades. She had no power. What she had was her grandmother's name, and a road. Mabel was at the door before she had consciously decided to move. Her cloak was already on. She pulled the small wooden box from beneath the loose floorboard in the bedroom, the one that held her savings, a folded letter from her mother, and a ring her father had given her before he died, silver with a small amber stone. She tucked the box inside her cloak. She did not look back at the dead lavender. She was 3 streets from the edge of the village when she heard it, voices, low and urgent, coming from the narrow gap between the alehouse and the cobbler's workshop. She would have walked past. She nearly did. But one of the voices said her name, and her feet stopped before her mind caught up. Mabel Caldwell won't be a problem. The voice was male, one she recognized, Corvin, Edric Fenn's younger brother, and the pack's internal counsel. Dorian doesn't want the alliance anymore. He never did. But the Caldwell Land Registry is still in her name. The Northern Holdings. A pause. Another voice, older, lower. She'll contest it. She won't know there's anything to contest. Dorian files the dissolution with the council before she can speak. The land transfers automatically under the old statutes. She walks away with the house and nothing else. And if she asks questions? Corvin's voice was very calm. She's human. She has no standing. She asks questions. We remind her of that. Mabel stood in the mud between 2 buildings with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The wind had gone cold. Somewhere above her, a shutter banged open and shut. Her grandmother's land. The Northern Holdings. She hadn't even known they were in her name. Her father had never told her. And Dorian had known. And Edric had known. And they had arranged this entire year. The absence, the abandonment, the quiet shame of it, to ensure she would be too broken and too grateful for his return to pay attention to what was actually being taken from her. She made herself breathe. She made herself walk. By the time she reached the edge of Ashvale, where the pine forest began, she was running. The forest swallowed her whole. One moment, there was the village at her back. Smoke, mud, the faint creak of the mill, and then the pines closed around her and everything became shadow and cold. The ground shifted from packed earth to a carpet of needles that muffled her footsteps, and the air tasted of resin and damp bark and something older underneath, something the forest had been holding in its roots for centuries. Mabel ran until her lungs burned, then walked until her legs steadied, then stood very still in a small clearing and tried to think. She was not foolish enough to believe that running into a forest at midday without a direction was a plan. She knew the northern road crossed through the edge of these woods before opening into the Highland territories. She knew that beyond the Ashvale boundary, 3 hours on foot, if the old maps her father had kept were accurate, the land changed jurisdiction. No Fen Pack authority, no Corvin with his careful voice and his quiet arrangements. She also knew she had perhaps half a day before someone noticed she was gone. Dorian's return was in 10 days. The land transfer, if she had understood Corvin correctly, would be filed with the council before then. Which meant she had very little time and no allies and no understanding of how land registry law worked in a wolf pack's legal structure. She was running from something she barely understood toward something she couldn't yet see. Her father had told her once, "When you don't know the full map, follow the oldest road. Old roads lead to old places, and old places remember things the new ones don't." She found the northern road by following the slope of the ground. The cold came faster than she expected. She had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when the sky, which had been a flat pale gray since morning, began to drop. Not rain, something thicker. The temperature fell with the kind of speed that felt deliberate, the wind arriving in long, steady pushes that cut through her wool cloak as though it were linen. The trees thinned as she climbed, and without their shelter the cold had full reach. Mabel pulled the cloak tighter and kept moving. She was thinking about the northern holdings. Her father had mentioned land once when she was very young, not as something valuable, but as something old. "Your grandmother held that ground before the packs redrew the territories," he had said. "It's been Caldwell land since before I was born." She had not understood then what that meant in a world where pack boundaries shifted and Alpha authority reshaped property rights like rivers reshaping riverbeds. She was beginning to understand now. The amber ring felt heavy in the box beneath her cloak. She was so focused on the ground ahead that she almost didn't hear the horses. The sound reached her before the riders appeared. The irregular rhythm of hooves moving fast on frozen ground, more than one horse, coming from the direction she was heading rather than behind her. She stepped off the road into the shadow of a cluster of birch trees, pressing her back against the white bark, and waited. 3 horses, 4 riders. They came over the rise at a speed that meant urgency, and in the gray afternoon light, Mabel could make out the colors they wore. Not fen green, not any pack color she recognized from Ashvale. Dark wool, dark leather, the kind of practical riding gear that spoke of long distances and no interest in ceremony. The lead rider was large, broad-shouldered, with dark braided hair that moved in the wind. He sat the horse with the settled authority of someone who had been riding since before he could walk. They were past her in seconds, or they should have been. The lead rider slowed, stopped. Mabel held very still. He turned his horse with a single shift of his weight, and in the fading afternoon light, she saw his face clearly for the first time. Sharp-boned and weathered, with pale eyes that caught the gray sky and held it. A scar ran along the left side of his jaw, thin and old. He looked at the birch trees where she stood as though he could see straight through them. "Come out," he said. His voice was low and even, with the texture of someone who did not need to raise it to be heard. "The cold will kill you before nightfall if you stay on this road without shelter." Mabel did not move. "I'm not from Ashvale," he said, as though he knew exactly what she was afraid of. "And I have no interest in your business. But there is a storm coming down from the northern ridge, and you are standing in the middle of it in a wool cloak that is already soaked through." She looked down. He was right. The cloak had absorbed more cold moisture than she'd realized, and her fingers inside it had gone numb at the tips. She had been walking on adrenaline and hadn't noticed. She stepped out from the birch trees. His pale eyes moved over her once, not in appraisal, but in the quick, efficient assessment of someone cataloging a situation. She had the impression he was noting the mud on her boots, the box-shaped outline under her cloak, the fact that she was alone on a highland road in deteriorating weather with no horse and no companion. "Where are you going?" he asked. "North," she said. "North is 3 more hours on foot. You won't make it before the storm breaks." He was already turning his horse. "There is a way station a 1/4 hour's ride from here. Stone walls, dry wood, enough room." He glanced back at her over his shoulder. "You can ride with Aldrich." One of the other riders, younger, with a close-cropped beard and a cautious expression, moved his horse slightly forward. Mabel stood in the road and looked at 4 strangers in dark riding gear and tried to calculate every possible risk against the fact that she could no longer feel her fingers. "I don't know who you are," she said. The lead rider's expression didn't change. "No, you don't." He did not offer his name. He simply waited, with the patience of someone accustomed to people eventually making the correct decision. The wind arrived in a long, brutal gust that carried the first needles of ice in it. Mabel walked toward the younger rider's horse. The way station was exactly as described: stone, dry, smelling of old ash and pine. Someone had used it recently enough that there was still split wood stacked beside the hearth, and within 20 minutes one of the riders had a fire going that pushed the cold back to the walls. Mabel sat on a wooden bench near the hearth, with her cloak spread to dry and her hands wrapped around a tin cup of something hot that tasted of bark and dried berries. She watched them without being obvious about it. 4 men. Disciplined. They spoke to each other in short exchanges, moved with economy, handled the horses with the ease of long practice. No one touched her things. No one stood too close. The lead rider, the one with the braided hair and the pale eyes, sat at the rough table near the single window and unrolled a map, studying it with a focused quiet that made him seem entirely self-contained. "Thank you," Mabel said finally. It felt insufficient, but she said it. He looked up from the map. "You're from Asheville." It wasn't a question. She wondered what had given her away. The cloak style, the direction she'd been traveling, something in the way she spoke. "I was," she said carefully. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration, as though that single word had told him something meaningful. "Fen Pack territory," he said. "Yes." He held her gaze for a moment. His eyes, she noticed, were not entirely gray. There was a quality to them in firelight, something layered and still. "Are they looking for you?" "Not yet," she said. "By tomorrow, probably." He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he'd already suspected, and returned to his map. Mabel looked into the fire and thought about Corvin's voice in the alley. She's human. She has no standing. She thought about her grandmother's land and the amber ring and her father's careful hands folding a map on a table very much like this one. She thought about Dorian Fenn's easy smile and the letter in his coat pocket and the 11 months of silence she had spent convincing herself she was healing when in fact she had simply been waiting. She was done waiting. The northern holdings passed the Ashvale boundary, she said, without looking away from the fire. Who holds authority over land disputes in that territory? A pause. That land falls under the jurisdiction of the High Council, the lead writer said. His voice was carefully neutral. Any dispute would be heard by the Crown Authority. Mabel finally looked at him. And who is the Crown Authority? The fire cracked. One of the other riders near the door went very still. The man at the table folded the map with slow, deliberate movements and met her eyes across the room. Currently, he said, that would be me. The way station was very quiet. Mabel looked at the man sitting at the rough wooden table in his dark riding coat, with his braided hair and his old scar and his pale eyes, and she understood, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives all at once, like cold water, that she had not stumbled onto a road by accident. Or perhaps she had, but the road had not been as empty as it appeared. You're Orion, she said. Not a question this time. Yes, he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the fire. Then I need to speak with you, she said, about land that was stolen before I even knew I owned it. He did not look surprised. He did not look many things she was beginning to understand. He simply pulled the map back out, set it flat on the table, and said, Tell me. She told him everything, not because she trusted him. She did not yet. Not in the way that trust needs roots before it can hold weight. But she was sitting in a stone way station in the middle of a highland storm with nowhere left to go. And the man across the table was either the one person who had the authority to help her, or the one person powerful enough to destroy her completely. Either way, silence was no longer a strategy. She told him about her father, about the marriage arrangement, the Fen name, the house that was never hers. She told him about Dorian's absence and the letter in the coat pocket, and the 11 months that had passed like a slow bleed. She told him about Corvin's voice in the alley between the alehouse and the cobbler's workshop, low and certain. She's human. She has no standing. And the land registry she hadn't known existed until the moment she heard it being taken from her. She kept her voice level throughout. She did not cry. She had done her crying a long time ago, in a kitchen that smelled of someone else's bread, and she had nothing left of that particular grief to spend in front of strangers. When she finished, the fire had burned down to a steadier, quieter heat. The storm outside pressed against the stone walls in long, low pulses. Orion had not interrupted her once. He sat with his forearms resting on the table and his pale eyes on her face, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being read. Not judged, but genuinely read, the way a person reads a document they intend to act on. When she stopped speaking, he was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone deciding what to say. The silence of someone who had already decided and was simply letting the weight of what they'd heard settle properly. The Caldwell Northern Holdings, he said. Your grandmother's land. Yes. Do you have any documentation? Any record of the registry in her name? Mabel reached beneath her cloak and opened the small wooden box. Beneath the folded letter from her mother and the amber ring, there was a piece of paper she had almost left behind. A habit of keeping things she didn't fully understand yet, something her father had taught her. She had found it tucked inside the lining of the box itself, written in her father's hand, years old and soft at the folds. She had never known what it was for. She set it on the table. Orion unfolded it with careful hands. He read it in silence. Something in his expression shifted, very slightly, but she caught it. This is a lineage land declaration, he said, filed under the old Caldwell name before the pack boundary redraws. It predates the Fen territory claim by at least 2 decades. He looked up. This is not just a family property, Mabel. Under High Council statutes, lineage land of this age cannot be transferred through a dissolution proceeding. It requires a direct hearing, which Corvin was planning to avoid entirely. Yes. His voice was flat, not angry, something more contained than anger. Because if it went to a hearing, they would lose. The younger writer, Aldrich, said something quietly from near the door. Orion responded in a few short words without looking away from the document. Then he refolded it with the same care he'd used to open it and placed it in front of her. "Keep that," he said. "Don't let it out of your hands." Mabel took it back. "What happens now?" "Now," he said, "we wait out the storm. In the morning, you come with us to Crestmore." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know you." "You know who I am." "That's not the same thing." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the nearest thing to one she'd seen from him. It lasted less than a second and was gone. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He stood, pushing back from the table, and his full height in the low-ceilinged way station was considerable. "You can sleep on the bench nearest the fire. The door has a bolt. Aldrich takes first watch outside." He met her eyes one last time. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to come to a place where the law can protect you. Those are different requests." She said nothing as he moved toward the back of the way station where his men had laid out their bedrolls. She sat with her box in her lap and the document pressed against her ribs and the fire burning low in front of her, and she thought about different requests, and what it meant that he had understood to make that distinction. She slept badly, and woke before dawn. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the world outside the way station scraped clean and bitterly cold. Frost had formed on the inside of the single window, fine white crystals spreading from the corners like a slow map of something. Mabel sat up on the bench with her cloak pulled around her and watched the frost patterns for a moment, before the sound of movement at the hearth pulled her attention. Orion was already awake. He had rebuilt the fire, she hadn't heard him do it, and was standing at the window with a cup in his hands, looking out at the pale pre-dawn. He had removed his riding coat at some point, and wore a dark tunic with the leather harness straps crossed over his chest. The braids in his hair had been loosened slightly, and without the riding coat, he looked less like a figure of authority and more like a man who had been awake for a long time, thinking about difficult things. He heard her move and glanced over. "There is hot water in the pot." She got up, found a tin cup, and poured. The water was plain but hot, and she held it in both hands and stood a few feet from the fire and tried to organize her thoughts. "Crestmore," she said. "How far?" "A 4 hours ride." "And when we arrive, what exactly is my position there? Am I a guest? A petitioner? A problem you've decided to solve?" He turned from the window. In the firelight, his expression was easier to read than it had been the night before. Or perhaps she was simply learning its geography. "You are someone with a legitimate legal claim who requires access to the High Council's records and a formal hearing process. That is your position. And yours? Mine is to ensure the process is not corrupted before it begins." He paused. "Which it will be, if Edric Fenn reaches his council contacts before you reach mine." Mabel thought about that. The Fenn pack had influence, not enormous, but targeted, the kind of influence built through years of small favors and quiet arrangements. Edric was not a stupid man. When she disappeared from Ashvale, he would understand immediately that something had shifted. He would move fast. "He'll send men after me," she said. "Probably. And you're not concerned about that." Orion's pale eyes held hers with a steadiness that was almost unsettling. "Let them come," he said simply. It was not a boast. That was what stopped her from dismissing it. There was no performance in it, no attempt to impress her. It was simply a fact, stated with the calm of someone who had faced considerably worse and was not particularly afraid of what Edric Fenn could send down a Highland road. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she drank her hot water and said, "We should leave before full light." "Yes," he said, "we should." They rode hard through the morning. Mabel shared Aldrich's horse again, sitting behind him and holding the wooden box under her cloak with one hand and the saddle leather with the other. The highland landscape opened around them as they climbed. Broad slopes of pale grass gone silver with frost, clusters of dark pine in the valleys below. The sky a deep and serious blue that meant the cold had settled in properly. Her breath fogged in front of her face with every exhale. She watched Orion ride. He led without announcing it, which she found herself noticing with a kind of reluctant attention. He did not look back to check on his riders. He did not give unnecessary commands. He simply moved through the landscape with a certainty that the others oriented around naturally, the way water finds the lowest point without being directed. She understood, watching him, why a man like this would be AlphaKing. It was not the size of him, though he was large. It was not the scar or the braided hair or the dark riding coat. It was the quality of his attention. He was always watching, always processing, and none of it looked like effort. She thought about Dorian. The comparison arrived without invitation, and she let it sit, briefly, because it was useful to feel the difference clearly. Dorian had been charming in rooms. He had known how to enter a gathering and arrange himself to best advantage. He had laughed at the right moments and said the right things, and looked at her in ways that felt like warmth until she understood they were performance. He had been skilled at appearing present while being entirely elsewhere. Orion had not smiled at her once. He had not told her she was brave, or that everything would be fine. He had looked at a legal document and told her the truth about what it meant, and then he had made a fire and let her sleep. She was not sure which of those things frightened her more. Crestmore appeared in the early afternoon. Gray stone walls rising from a ridge above the highland, towers at each corner, banners moving in the cold wind. As they crested the last rise, Mabel saw the full scale of it and understood properly for the first time exactly who she had ridden through a storm with. This was not a pack house. This was a seat of power, old and unmistakable, built to last centuries, and looking as though it intended to. At the gate, a guard stepped forward and then stopped when he saw the lead rider, straightening immediately. Orion did not slow. Inside the walls, the courtyard smelled of horses and stone, and the faint sweetness of burning oak from somewhere inside the main structure. Stable hands appeared. Aldrich dismounted and offered Mabel a hand down that she took without thinking about it. She stood on the cobblestones of Crestmore and looked up at the walls around her and felt, for the first time in perhaps a year, something that was not fear and not grief, and not the hollow exhaustion of waiting. It felt dangerously close to the beginning of something. A figure appeared in the main doorway. A woman of middle years, sharp-eyed and composed, in a dark dress and a ring of keys at her belt. She looked at Orion, then at Mabel, then back at Orion with an expression that asked a great many questions without voicing any of them. "Prepare the East Wing room," Orion said as he passed her. "Our guest will be staying." The woman's gaze settled on Mabel with the careful assessment of someone whose job it was to understand things quickly. Then she nodded once and turned back inside. Mabel gripped the wooden box beneath her cloak and followed. Behind her, the gates of Crestmore closed with a sound like a verdict. The East Wing room smelled of beeswax and clean linen. Mabel stood in the center of it for a long moment after the woman with the keys, who had introduced herself only as Hesta, in the tone of someone who considered names sufficient information, had shown her the wash basin, the wardrobe with its spare wool dresses, and the window that looked out over the inner courtyard. Then Hesta had left, pulling the door closed behind her, and Mabel was alone for the first time since she had run from Ashvale. She sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was stuffed with something soft, covered in linen that had been washed so many times it had gone the color of cream. There was a small fire already burning in the stone hearth across from her. A candle on the table beside the bed. A pitcher of water with a cloth folded next to it. Someone had prepared this room before she arrived. She thought about that for a moment. Orion had sent no message ahead. She had ridden with his party the entire way, which meant either someone at Crestmore kept a guest room perpetually ready, or Orion had communicated something during the ride that she hadn't seen or heard. She decided it didn't matter right now. What mattered was the document pressed against her ribs, still warm from her body. What mattered was the hearing that needed to happen before Edric Fenn's men reached whatever council contacts he had cultivated over decades of careful maneuvering. What mattered was the Northern Holdings, her grandmother's land, her father's trust, being quietly swallowed by people who had decided she was too insignificant to notice the theft. She set the wooden box on the table beside the candle and opened it. The amber ring caught the firelight and held it, warm and steady. She picked it up and turned it between her fingers. Her father had placed it on her palm the week before he died, with both his hands around hers, and said, "This was your grandmother's." She was not a woman who accepted less than what she was owed. Neither are you, even if you haven't learned that yet. She had thought, at the time, that he was simply saying kind things because he was dying. She was beginning to think he had known something she hadn't. She found Orion in the library the following morning. She had slept, genuinely, deeply, which surprised her, and woken to gray light through the window and the sound of the courtyard below beginning its day. Hesta had appeared with bread and a cup of something hot and dark that tasted of roasted grain, and had told her, without being asked, that the Lord of Crestmore rose before dawn and could usually be found in the library until the morning council. The library was 2 floors, reached by a staircase of dark polished wood, with shelves that went from floor to ceiling on every wall, and a long table down the center covered in maps and correspondence and ledgers, stacked with the organized chaos of genuine use. The smell of it, old paper, leather bindings, the ghost of 100 candles, settled something in Mabel's chest that she hadn't known was unsettled. Orion stood at the far end of the table with a letter in his hand, reading. He was in his dark tunic again, the leather straps of his harness crossing his chest, his braided hair pulled back. He did not look up when she entered, but he said, "Close the door." She did. "Sit," he said, still reading. "I'll be a moment." She sat at the nearest chair and looked at the maps spread across the table while she waited. The largest one showed the Highland territories in careful ink, pack boundaries marked in different colors, roads as thin lines, significant landmarks noted in a hand so precise it was almost mechanical. She found Ashvale without difficulty, a small territory in the lower left quadrant, marked in fen green. And there, just above the boundary line, in a region that bore no pack color at all, was a cluster of land marked with an older notation she didn't recognize. Her finger hovered over it without touching. "The Caldwell Holdings," Orion said. He had set the letter down and was watching her. "Unmarked because they predate the current boundary agreements. That's why the Fens believed they could absorb it through a dissolution proceeding. There's no active pack claim to contest. They assumed no one would look closely at the lineage documentation." "They assumed I didn't know it existed," Mabel said. "Yes." She pulled her hand back from the map. "And do you?" "Know it existed, I mean. Before yesterday." He paused, very briefly, just long enough to be honest. "I knew the Caldwell name was attached to a pre-boundary land declaration in the Northern Highlands. I did not know the current holder was living in Ashvale under a fen arrangement." His pale eyes were steady. "If I had known that, I would have moved sooner." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because what they were doing is illegal under High Council statutes. And because allowing powerful families to consume smaller ones through procedural maneuvering is exactly the kind of corruption that makes the Highland territories ungovernable." He said it without heat, the way someone states a principle they have held for a long time. "This is not sentiment. It is governance." Mabel considered that. It was not what she had expected him to say. She had expected something more comfortable, more reassuring. Instead, he had given her the political reality of it, cleanly and without softening. She found, to her slight surprise, that she preferred it. "I want to be present at the hearing," she said. "Not represented by someone else. Present myself." Something in his expression adjusted. Again that micro-shift that she was learning to read as close attention. "The council will be less comfortable with that. I know. They will attempt to redirect the proceedings through a legal representative. I know that too." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said simply. "Then we prepare you for it." The preparation took 3 days. Orion had a council secretary, a thin, precise man named Fowler, who wore ink stains on his right hand like a permanent accessory, bring her every relevant statute, record, and legal precedent related to lineage land, pre-boundary declarations, and dissolution proceedings under High Council jurisdiction. Mabel read all of it. She read in the library in the mornings, at the small table in her room by candlelight in the evenings, and she asked questions when she didn't understand something, and did not pretend she did when she didn't. Fowler seemed surprised by this. He had the manner of a man who expected to do the understanding on behalf of others. Orion did not seem surprised. On the second afternoon, he came to the library while she was working through a particularly dense section on pre-boundary territorial rights, and sat across from her without announcing his intention to stay. He read his own correspondence in silence while she worked. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the courtyard. It was, she realized, the most ordinary hour she had spent in a very long time. Simply a room with a fire and work to do, and another person who was not demanding anything from her. She did not say this out loud. She filed it somewhere careful. On the third evening, Hesta brought her supper on a tray and lingered in the doorway with the expression of someone who had decided to speak. "He doesn't bring people here," Hesta said. "Not accusatory, just informational." Mabel looked up from her reading. "I gathered that. He's been AlphaKing for 6 years. In 6 years I've seen him bring injured pack members for medical care, council delegates for meetings, and once a family of refugees from the Southern Territory collapse." Hesta adjusted the tray on the table with unnecessary precision. "He does not bring people and prepare rooms and sit in the library for 2 hours reading letters he could have read in his own office." Mabel said nothing. "I'm not suggesting anything," Hesta said, in the tone of someone suggesting something. "I'm providing context." "Thank you, Hesta." The woman left with the satisfaction of someone who had delivered a message successfully. Mabel sat with her supper and her papers and the fire, and she thought about a man who built his entire life around governance and law, and the ungovernable corruption of powerful families consuming smaller ones. And she thought about a letter in a coat pocket, and 11 months of silence, and a house that was never hers. And she told herself very firmly that those were entirely separate categories of thought. The message from Edric Fenn arrived on the morning of the 4th day. Orion brought it to her himself, which told her something about its contents before she read it. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Orion. Formal, careful, layered with the particular language of a man who believed himself to be negotiating from a position of strength. Edric acknowledged, with elaborate courtesy, that his pack's land registry matter had come to the attention of the AlphaKing. He expressed confidence that the situation was based on a misunderstanding. He indicated that his son Dorian, upon his return to Ashvale, would be happy to discuss the matter with appropriate legal representatives. He did not mention Mabel by name once. She set the letter down. "He doesn't know I'm here," she said. "He suspects. He doesn't know." Orion sat across from her at the library table. "He's trying to open a negotiation channel that excludes you entirely. If he can establish a dialogue between his people and mine before the hearing is formally called, he can reframe this as a pack boundary discussion rather than a lineage land dispute. Different statutes, different outcome. He's done this before. Several times." Orion's voice was even. "The Fenn pack has absorbed 3 smaller family territories in the past decade through variations of this approach. always procedural, always just within the edges of legality, always targeting people with no standing to contest it. Mabel looked at the letter. She thought about the 3 families before her. People whose names she didn't know, whose land had become fen territory through arrangements that looked like process and felt like theft. She thought about her father's careful hands on the amber ring. "Call the hearing," she said. Orion looked at her. "Now," she said, "before he can establish his channel. Call it today." A pause. Something moved through his pale eyes. Not surprise, but something she thought might be closer to respect, which was more startling. "It will move fast," he said. "Once called, the council convenes within 48 hours. Edric will be notified. He will come to Crestmoor, and he will bring Dorian." The name landed between them. She had not said it aloud since she'd left Ashvale, had barely thought it directly. Now it sat in the library air, attached to a reality she was going to have to face across a council table. "I know," she said. Orion held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he stood and crossed to the writing desk in the corner and picked up a clean sheet of paper and a pen and began to write. She watched his hand move across the page with the same settled certainty with which he did everything, and she breathed through the cold place in her chest where Dorian's name had landed, and she told herself, "This is not the end of something. This is the beginning of the part where it gets answered." Outside, the Highland wind moved through Crestmoor's banners, and the courtyard below filled with the ordinary sounds of a keep that had been standing for centuries and intended to stand for centuries more. The hearing was called. Edric Fenn arrived at Crestmoor on the 2nd morning. Mabel heard the horses in the courtyard from her window and did not go to look. She already knew what she would see. The fen green, the studied composure of a man who had spent decades arranging outcomes before anyone else knew a game was being played. She had dressed carefully that morning, in a dark wool dress that Hesta had produced without comment, with her braid pinned up and the amber ring on her right hand. She looked, she thought, like someone who intended to be taken seriously. Whether that would be enough remained to be seen. She found Orion in the corridor outside the council chamber, speaking quietly with Fowler. He stopped when he saw her and looked at her once in that way he had. Thorough, efficient, reading the room through her. Then he simply said, "Ready?" "Yes," she said, which was mostly true. "Edric brought Corvin," he said, "and Dorian." She absorbed this. All 3 of them. They came prepared to overwhelm the proceeding with numbers. It's a common tactic. His pale eyes were steady on hers. "It won't work. The council hears one voice at a time, and you have the documentation. Stay with the documentation." "I know," she said. He looked at her for one moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he opened the chamber door. The council chamber was a long, stone-walled room with high windows that let in the flat highland light in gray slabs. A rectangular table ran the length of it, with 5 council members already seated on one side. Older wolves, formally dressed, with the expressions of people who had heard a great many disputes and been moved by very few of them. At the far end, Edric Fenn stood speaking to one of them in a low voice. He stopped when Mabel entered. She had not seen Edric Fenn in almost a year. He was a compact, well-dressed man in his late 50s, with silver at his temples and a politician's face, arranged, always, into whatever expression was most advantageous. Right now, that expression was carefully neutral, with a layer of paternal concern laid over it like a glaze. Beside him, Corvin, and beside Corvin, Dorian. Mabel walked to her chair at the opposite end of the table and sat down, and she did not look at Dorian. Not yet. She placed the wooden box on the table in front of her and opened it, and removed the lineage declaration with both hands, and she set it flat on the table where anyone who looked at her would see it. Then she looked at Dorian. He had changed in 11 months in the way that people change when they have been living well while someone else has been struggling. He was slightly tanned, well-rested, wearing a traveling coat that was clearly new. His dark hair was neat. He looked at her across the length of the council table with an expression that she spent 1 second identifying. It was guilt, but the managed kind. Guilt that had been processed into something more comfortable, something closer to regret, which was easier to carry. He looked away first. Good, she thought, and turned to the head council member. The proceeding began with the formal statements. Edric spoke first, calmly, confidently, with the ease of a man who believed the framing was already set. He described the dissolution proceeding as a straightforward administrative matter. He acknowledged the Caldwell name with generous brevity. He expressed his deep respect for the late Aldous Caldwell's memory and his son-in-law's personal regret regarding the marriage's difficulties. He did not once use the word land. When he finished, the head council member, a woman of approximately 70 with iron-gray hair and a face like carved flint, turned to Mabel. "You have submitted a challenge to these proceedings on the grounds of lineage land status," she said. "Please present your basis." Mabel stood. She had read every statute. She had spent 3 days with ink-stained Fowler and his precise explanations, and she had asked every question she needed to ask, and she was not going to pretend she wasn't afraid, because she was, but fear and inability were not the same thing. She presented the lineage declaration first. She walked the council through its date, its filing notation, its pre-boundary status. She cited the specific High Council statute, Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the Highland Territorial Accords, that protected pre-boundary lineage lands from transfer through dissolution proceedings without a direct hearing. She pointed out, clearly and without editorial, that the Fen dissolution filing had made no reference to the existence of this declaration, which was either an oversight or a deliberate omission. She did not say which she believed it to be. She did not need to. The iron-gray council member looked at the document for a long time. Edric began to speak. Orion, from his position at the side of the room, present as the authority who had called the hearing, not as a party to it, said very quietly, "The petitioner has the floor." Edric stopped. "The documentation predates the current territorial arrangement by 23 years, Mabel continued. "My grandmother held this land under the Caldwell name. My father held it. Upon his death, it passed to me as the surviving Caldwell heir, and it has remained registered under that lineage continuously since before the Fen Pack extended its territory into the Ashevale region." She looked at the council members one by one, slowly, letting each of them see that she was not nervous, and she was not asking. This land cannot be absorbed through a dissolution proceeding. Any attempt to do so is not a procedural matter. It is a violation of High Council statutes, and I am here to ensure it is recognized as such. She sat down. The chamber was quiet. Then Corvin leaned forward and said, with the smooth precision of someone who had prepared for this, "The document's filing notation is disputed. The pre-boundary declaration office was dissolved 40 years ago, and verification of the original registration is no longer." "The original registration," Fowler's voice came from near the door, and Mabel turned to see him holding a leather-bound archive volume, "is cross-referenced in the Highland Territorial Records of the old filing office, which were transferred to High Council archives 18 years ago. The cross-reference notation is on page 2 of the document the petitioner has presented. The registration is valid." Corvin went very still. Edric's arranged face rearranged itself, briefly, into something that was not neutral at all. It took the council 40 minutes to deliberate. Mabel sat in an antechamber with Fowler and a cup of cold tea, and her hands flat on her knees, and she looked at the wall and breathed carefully. Through the heavy door, she could hear nothing. She did not try to imagine what was being said. She had done what she could do, and the rest was not in her hands. Orion appeared in the doorway at the 30-minute mark. He did not speak immediately. He stood with one shoulder against the doorframe and looked at her with an expression she was learning to read as something other than blankness. It was, She understood now. The face of someone who felt things with considerable depth and had long ago learned to hold them still. "You were very clear in there," he said. "I had good preparation." "The preparation doesn't matter without the clarity." He paused. "The council heard you. That was not guaranteed." She looked at him. "Were you worried?" A very brief pause. "Yes," he said simply, which surprised her entirely, because it was the first thing he had said in 4 days that sounded purely personal. She didn't know what to do with that, so she looked back at the wall. He stayed in the doorway until Fowler came to tell them the council was ready. The ruling was complete and unambiguous. The Caldwell Northern holdings were confirmed as pre-boundary lineage land. The Fen dissolution proceeding was invalidated as it pertained to any land transfer. The documentation was entered into the High Council's permanent record under Mabel Caldwell's name. Any future challenge to the land's status would require a full Highland territorial review, a process that took years and cost more than any pack gained from a single land parcel. Edric Fenn received the ruling with the stillness of a man recalculating at speed. Corvin's face had gone flat and unreadable. And Dorian. She allowed herself one last look at Dorian, who sat at the end of the table with the expression of someone watching something collapse that they had helped build without fully understanding what they were building, said nothing at all. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to, and she didn't. What she felt was something quieter and more permanent. The particular stillness of a weight being lifted that you had carried so long you had stopped noticing its presence. The land was hers. The hearing was over. Edric Fenn would return to Ashvale and file the dissolution properly, without the land, and it would be done. And whatever remained of that chapter of her life would close like a door that had been left open too long in cold weather. When the chamber emptied, she stood at the table alone for a moment. Then she picked up the lineage declaration, folded it carefully, and put it back in the wooden box beside her mother's letter and the amber ring. She left Crestmore 3 days later. Not because she was asked to. Hesta had made it quite clear in her oblique and efficient way that the East Wing room would remain available indefinitely, but because the northern holdings were 3 hours' ride beyond the Crestmore Ridge, and she had decided she wanted to see them. Her land, her grandmother's ground. She had never set eyes on it, and she thought it was time. Orion walked with her to the courtyard on the morning she left. It was a cold, clear day, the kind that made the highland look like something drawn in ink against a white sky. The horse Hesta had arranged for her, a steady gray mare, waited with her saddlebag already packed. "You know where it is?" Orion asked. Fowler drew me a map. She had checked it 3 times. The main house is in some disrepair. The caretaker's family has been maintaining the grounds. He paused. "I have had word sent ahead that you are coming." She looked at him. "When did you do that?" "Yesterday." He met her eyes with that settled directness that she had stopped finding unsettling somewhere around the 2nd day. "I anticipated you would want to go." She looked at him for a long moment in the cold courtyard light. She thought about a man who read maps alone by a window and built fires quietly and said yes when he was worried instead of pretending he wasn't. She thought about all the ways she had learned to recognize performance and all the ways he had never performed a single thing in her presence. "Thank you," she said. It was insufficient, and she knew it, and she said it anyway. He nodded once. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up onto the gray mare and settled the saddlebag and gathered the reins. Below, Crestmore's courtyard went about its morning. Above, the highland sky held its cold, clear light. "Mabel," Orion said. She looked down at him. He stood in the courtyard with his hands at his sides and his pale eyes on her face, and he said, "When you've seen the land, when you've decided what you want to do with it, what kind of life you want to build there, I would like to know." It was not a demand. It was not a claim. It was a man telling the truth about what he wanted in the plainest possible language and leaving the answer entirely to her. She held his gaze for a moment that stretched past the comfortable. Then she said, "I'll send word." And she rode out through Crestmore's gates into the Highland morning, toward the land her grandmother had held, that her father had protected, that a room full of powerful men had tried to take from her, and that was hers now, wholly, legally, permanently hers. She saw the northern holdings for the first time at noon, when the cold light sat flat and honest over everything. Rolling ground, mostly, with a stone boundary wall along the east edge half covered in moss. A woodline of pine and birch to the north. A low stone house with a good roof. Smoke rising from the chimney where the caretaker's family had lit a fire against the cold. A field lying fallow that would need a season's work before it was worth anything. A well with an iron handle, still functional. Her grandmother's kitchen garden, overgrown, but with the bones of something that had once been tended with love still visible underneath. Mabel dismounted and stood in the cold and looked at all of it. Her land. She picked up a handful of the earth near the boundary wall. It was cold and dark and smelled of iron and winter. She held it in her palm for a moment, then let it fall back where it belonged. The caretaker, a weathered, quiet woman named Britta, who had maintained the property for years out of loyalty to a memory, came out to meet her, and said nothing more than was needed, and showed her through the house with careful respect. The rooms were small and solid and cold, and they smelled of old stone and pine smoke and thyme. There was a window in the main room that looked north, and when Mabel stood at it, she could see the wood line, and beyond it, the gray-blue smudge of the Highland Ridge. She thought about her father. She thought about her grandmother, whom she had never known, but who had held this ground before the maps were redrawn. She thought about what it meant to come from something and not know it until the moment someone tried to take it from you. She thought about a man in a courtyard, telling her he wanted to know what she decided. She stayed at the northern holdings for a month, and then another. Brita taught her which fields needed draining and which kept water well, and which sections of the boundary wall needed rebuilding before winter deepened further. The caretaker's daughter, a girl of perhaps 12, solemn and watchful, sometimes followed Mabel on her morning walks at a respectful distance, and Mabel began leaving an extra cup of warm broth on the step, and they understood each other without much language. She wrote to her mother. A real letter. Long and honest. The kind she hadn't written in over a year, because there had been too much she hadn't wanted to say. Her mother wrote back within a fortnight, 3 pages, her handwriting looping and warm, and said she had always known the Caldwell land was hers, and she had prayed every night that someone would help her find it. She wrote to Orion once, in the 2nd month. A short letter, factual, describing the state of the property and her plans for the spring. She did not write anything beyond that. His reply came within a week. Also short. Also factual. He mentioned that the Fen dissolution had been filed properly, without land transfer, and confirmed, with the precision she had come to expect from him, that Corvin had been formally censured by the High Council for procedural misconduct. Edric Fen had accepted the censure without public challenge. Dorian had returned to the Eastern Territories, and by all accounts, intended to remain there. The last line of Orion's letter read, "I am glad you found it in the state it deserved." She read that line 3 times, and then folded the letter and put it in the wooden box beside her mother's letter and the amber ring. He came in the spring. Not announced, not with ceremony. She was in the kitchen garden with her sleeves rolled and her hands in the cold soil, pulling the overgrown roots that had choked the old planting rows, when she heard a horse in the lane. She looked up and saw the dark riding coat and the braided hair and the pale eyes in the clear April light, and she sat back on her heels and looked at him. He dismounted and walked to the garden fence and stopped there, with his hands resting on the post, and looked at the land around him. The repaired wall, the turned fields, the smoke rising from the chimney. And something in his face said what he thought of it without him needing to speak. "You've been working," he said. "Yes." It looks like itself again. She stood and brushed the earth from her hands. "Brita says it looked like this when my grandmother kept it." He looked at her then, across the garden fence, in the spring light that was entirely different from the gray highland cold in which they had first spoken. She could read him better now, after months of his letters, which had grown incrementally longer without either of them remarking on it. She could read the thing in his face that he was not yet saying. "You came to ask me something," she said. "Yes." "Then ask it." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of hesitation. His silences were never hesitation. The silence of someone who intended to say something exactly right. "I would like to come back," he said. "If you are willing. Not to arrange anything or propose anything or change what you've built here. Just to come back and see you." The kitchen garden smelled of turned earth and the first green things pushing through the cold soil. Behind her, the stone house held its solid quiet. Above them both, the April sky was the clean, pale blue of something that had been waiting a long time to open. Mabel looked at him across the fence. "Come back next week," she said. "I'll have Brita make enough supper for 3. Something moved in his face that was not quite the almost smile she had catalogued in the waystation firelight. It was fuller than that. It was the face of a man who had spent a long time being entirely self-contained and had just allowed one thing, carefully, to be otherwise. "Next week," he said. He came back next week, and the week after, and the one after that. By summer, there was no question of him leaving. In the end, the story of Mabel Caldwell was not the story of what had been done to her, though much had been. It was not the story of Dorian Fenn, who lived out his years in the Eastern Territories and faded, as small men do, into the general noise of history. It was not the story of Edric Fenn, who died 2 years later, with his pack intact, but his reputation reduced to a cautionary tale told in council chambers about what happened when powerful men underestimated paperwork. It was not even the story of Corvin, who spent the remainder of his career under the High Council's close attention and never arranged another quiet outcome for anyone. The story of Mabel Caldwell was the story of land and lineage, and the particular courage required to walk toward something you almost didn't know to claim. It was the story of a woman who had been handed to strangers and handed back to herself, and who had known, standing in a kitchen garden in April with earth on her hands, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. It was the story of a man who had asked to come back and been told, "Next week," and who had come back every week until the weeks became a life. The northern holdings prospered. The fields came back. The kitchen garden grew. The boundary wall was rebuilt stone by stone and stood. And in the High Council's permanent record, in careful ink under the Highland Territorial Accords, the Caldwell name held the land it had always held, registered, protected, and permanent, as it had always been meant to be.